Good morning, everyone. People are still joining, so we wait a couple of minutes until everybody has joined. I can see the participants list is building up slowly. So welcome to the Buildings Policy Panel. Veit Bürger, who you can see on the screen from the Öko Institute, and myself are the panel leaders. I'm Jan Rosenau, and I'm the Europe Director at the Regulatory Assistance Project. And this morning we have, I think, a very exciting topic to discuss, which is the subject to many debates in different countries across Europe and also across the world, actually. And we have three excellent presentations, all dealing with the issue of heat decarbonization in Germany. And we have the first presentation from Benjamin Köhler, also from the Öko Institute, so a colleague of Veit's, who is going to talk about the systems analysis around decarbonizing heating in Germany. And I very much look forward to his presentation. Benjamin, over to you, or over to your recording.
Hello, my name is Benjamin Köhler from the Öko Institute in Freiburg, and I will talk about the systemic challenges of Germany's heat transition, a measure and policy roadmap for a climate-neutral building stock. The presentation is split into 5 main parts: the methodology, the cross-analysis of existing scenarios, risks for a successful heat transition, the measure and policy roadmap, and in the end, a short summary and conclusion. In the cross-analysis of existing studies and scenarios, we analyzed 10 studies for 95% greenhouse gas emission reduction in Germany's energy system. From that, we derived key technologies, measures, and instruments for a successful heat and energy transition. The goal of the risks and deficit analysis was to identify and assess challenges for achieving the 2050 targets in the building sector. Therefore, we optimized the transformation pathway for the whole energy system with the model REMOD developed by Fraunhofer ISE. Based on the reference development or reference pathway, we quantified additional final energy demands and CO2 emissions from 3 sensitivities, which are an insufficient refurbishment rate, an insufficient refurbishment depth, and the third sensitivity is missing renewable targets in buildings, so-called fuel switch. For all sensitivities, there are 3 compensation options. 2 of them address the increased use of domestic renewable energies. The first one is PV plus heat pump, the second one, the installation of solar thermal collectors. The third compensation option is an import of additional synthetic fuels produced from renewable electricity, power to gas and power to liquid. Finally, we developed 2 roadmaps. One roadmap with measures from a technical and economic perspective. A measure is thereby an activity to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. The second roadmap has a policy perspective, and in this roadmap we identified and developed instruments. An instrument is a policy intervention that aims to stimulate or support the necessary measures. From the cross-analysis of existing scenarios, one can see that the end energy demand in the building sector is highly reduced compared with 2008 levels. In the target scenarios, the reduction is up to 75 or 76%. The only exception is the IEA 2050 scenarios, in which there is actually no real reduction in final energy demand. All scenarios have virtually no emissions. In the target scenarios, there is a maximum of 6 million ton CO2 equivalents per year in one scenario. As we have seen, there is a high demand reduction, and the underlying full refurbishment rates are between 1.4 and 3.9% per year, and in most scenarios well over 2% between 2020 and 2050. The only exception is the IEK 2050 scenario, in which there is only 1.1% refurbishment rate between 2031 and 2050. And in addition, there are some technologies installed in the system with a comparably low thermal efficiency, like for example fuel cells. The average end energy demand reduction is 58%. The heat supply, the most important technologies are heat pumps with an average share of 53% in end energy supply, and district heating with a share of 15 to 40%. The role of biomass strongly differs amongst the scenarios between 11 and 100 terawatt hours. In most scenarios, it's mainly used for high temperature processes in industry or to supply transport fuels. Power to gas and power to liquid only play a subordinate role in most scenarios, and only a few scenarios consider the use in the building sector. However, in the overall energy system, in some scenarios, large amounts are needed, up to over 1,000 terawatt hours per year in 2050, from which most must be imported. The risks we analyzed are, on the one hand, as said before, insufficient refurbishment rate, insufficient refurbishment depth, and insufficient fuel switch. In the target pathway, we assumed a full refurbishment rate of 2.3 to 2.6% between 2021 and 2050. And concerning the refurbishment depth, 34% of the refurbished buildings until then are fully refurbished, and 66% are fully refurbished plus. Fully refurbished is comparable to new building built today, and fully refurbished plus is comparable with a passive house. In sensitivity 1, the refurbishment rate is reduced to 1 to 1.2%, and the refurbishment depth is like in the reference pathway. In sensitivity 2, the refurbishment rate is like in the reference pathway, but the useful energy demand for heating is only reduced by 13% in the buildings which are currently not refurbished. In sensitivity 3, in the target pathway, which is an optimization, heat pumps have a share of 32% in end energy supply, and in the sensitivity, the share is limited to 15%. Here you can see the development of the installed heating technologies in buildings until 2050. In the reference pathway, you can see that district heating, which is the lower green big block, is increasing tremendously up to 40%, approximately 40% in 2050. The light blue and purple parts are the heat pumps, which make up 32% of all installed technologies, and you can see that there is still a large amount of gas boilers or gas burning boilers in buildings installed. That means that also the gas used there must be completely decarbonized to achieve the overall target. In this figure, you can see the difference in the end energy demand between the sensitivities compared to the reference pathway. You can see that in all sensitivities, the end energy demand is increasing by 114 and 225 terawatt hours in sensitivities 1 and 2. And the additional demand is mainly supplied through heat pumps, district heating, and power to gas. In sensitivity 3, the increase is a bit lower, only 27 terawatt hours per year, and the compensation is mainly achieved through power to gas, as heat pumps are no option in this scenario. For calculating the energy-related CO2 emission reduction and deviation from the target in 2050, we assumed that the additional need for gaseous and liquid fuels is completely supplied by fossil fuels in 2050 for the whole energy system. That leads to increased emissions of 8.2 to 56.5 million tons CO2 in 2050. That is a deviation of the target of 5.7%. To compensate, we calculated how much additional PV is needed in order to operate heat pumps needed for supplying the additional 114 or 225 terawatt hours in sensitivities 1 and 2. And for the operation, we need 35 or 70 gigawatt respectively additional PV installation. For comparison, in the reference pathway, there are already 225 gigawatt installed. The option solar thermal, this is possible in all three sensitivities. And to supply the additional end energy demand for heating and domestic hot water, we would need 3 to 13 square meters on each single building in Germany. The compensation option import of synthetic CH4 or liquid fuels, you can see in the table below, the additional demand in the whole energy system is between 220 and almost or approximately 3,000 terawatt hours per year in 2050, leading to 24 to 472 billion euro additional costs. From that, we derived measure and policy roadmap. In the following, I will only talk about the policy roadmap. You can see here the required policies and instruments for the overall or subordinate regulation. There are many strategic long-term planning instruments. We see a strong need for defining pathways on a municipal level, so a commitment to strategic municipal heat planning. And we also see the need to define in the short run where biomass should be used in future limited. Concerning the demand reduction, we see a strong role of the Energy Building Act, in which a clear target timetable should be defined, but also target-oriented standards for new constructions, but also refurbishments are needed to achieve the long-term goals. The Energy Buildings Act also has a strong role concerning the supply technologies. We see the need to probably ban several different technologies. Oil boilers, at least monovalent oil boilers, will be banned in the near future, but we see the need to also ban hybrid oil boilers and monovalent natural gas boilers, as we do not see a role for fossil fuel burning boilers in the future. For all the demand reduction, but also the supply technologies, subsidies have to be target oriented in the end. Concerning district heating, there is the need to increase the share of renewables in the district heating networks. One possibility is to define minimum quotas until 2050 to define a transformation pathway for district heating in Germany. And also here there is the need to have consistent subsidy systems in place to organize the network expansion, network optimization, and decarbonization. To come to the summary and conclusion, we can see that a complete decarbonization of the heat supply in Germany is possible, but the transformation of the sector will lead to enormous changes in the heat supply structure, both decentralized in single buildings, but also in district heating. To achieve the long-term target of a completely emission-free heating sector in a cost-effective way, there are several options on the supply side, like heat pumps, district heating, but also other options. The set of instruments defined should be accompanied by an effective CO2 pricing. We see that this is really essential. And always when a set of instrument is designed, the social distribution effects and social hardship must be considered. There are some no-regret measures, which are a strong increase, a strong decrease, I'm sorry, of the heating energy demand in buildings by increasing refurbishment rate, but also the depth. And as we do have long investment cycles, adjustments must be done today or as soon as possible. The key technologies for space heating and domestic hot water are heat pumps and district heating. The share of boilers will drop, and to foster this development, bans are one effective target-oriented option. The future heat supply structure strongly depends on local conditions. Therefore, we see mandatory municipal heat planning as a key instrument for the future, which should be established as soon as possible. A clear vision of the future supply structure is very helpful for all stakeholders in the sector. And the heat transition as a whole needs a consistent policy framework consisting of strategic, advisory, informative, regulatory instruments complemented by target-oriented subsidies. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Benjamin, for your recorded presentation. Very clear. We already have some questions that are coming in. And the first question that has been asked by someone in the audience, and I'll read this out directly, is the German federal government is promoting the extension of the EU ETS to heating, so the building sector. What is your position on this very live debate?
I would say that this is absolutely necessary instrument, and it can play a key role in the future, even though the current prices from my point of view are not high enough to really induce the needed changes in the system. And also there's currently a debate going on who should pay for the emissions, especially in rented apartments. Currently, the tenants have to pay everything. So actually the ones who will or have to install and can invest in refurbishments or new technologies, they are not hit by the price yet. But we see that the price alone will not be enough for the change needed.
Thanks, Benjamin. Just to maybe ask a follow-up question, if I may.
Yes,
you already pointed to the issue of equity and how this could affect low-income customers in particular. Are there ways you think how that could be addressed to soften the impact on low-income customers in a way that makes it politically more acceptable?
You mean the CO2 price, or in general the costs associated with the refurbishment?
The both. I mean, the CO2 price and the ability of people to respond to it, or by lowering the energy demand and the cost.
Well, there are several options currently discussed concerning the CO2 price. One option is that landlords have to pay 50% of the CO2 costs, the additional costs. This is an ongoing debate. The government said they want to do it, but the parliament is currently blocking this decision. Generally, also with the current setup, especially very low income households do pay less because some of the incomes from the CO2 price are used to limit the so-called EEG-Umlage. So that's the additional cost for renewable electricity paid by with the electricity bill. And the savings there are relatively high, especially for low-income households. Nevertheless, especially when we look to deep refurbishments and the needs there, we need some adjustments, like either by directly supporting low-income households in their rent, or by changing the system of sharing the costs, or like increasing the rents of low-income households. Currently, investment costs can be like 8% of the investment costs can be pushed forward or pulled to the tenants directly, and this rate is seen as too high, or the general system currently is seen as too high. But well, there are several options in the discussion in the moment, 5 to 6 different options. I currently cannot say which one will be the one that will come into force.
Thanks, Benjamin. We've got 2 more questions that have come in.
Yes.
In the meantime. One is about energy sufficiency policies, and what do you think their role is to reduce energy demand in addition to efficiency policy?
I see that there is a large reduction potential with sufficiency, connected to sufficiency. However, I fear that sufficiency policy will face enormous acceptance challenges, and a lot of discussions will follow. So I think, well, make it short, high potential, but difficult to implement.
Very clear, thank you. And then there's a quick technical question. What does the heat pump share in your presentation refer to? Only electricity or also the ambient heat?
Also the ambient heat.
So I think that clarifies the question. I think we have 3 more minutes until we start with the next presentation. So I have a question that I would like to ask you on the role of hydrogen or other power to gas fuels, which are suggested, at least by some, as a drop-in solution to decarbonize heating that would no longer require extensive retrofit, would no longer require energy efficiency improvements, because you're simply changing out the fuel. What is your view on that, based on the studies that you've analyzed for your paper?
I would say, even if hydrogen or other power to gas or synthetic gases are used in the building sector, it's absolutely necessary to decrease the end energy demand in the buildings. Because otherwise the needed renewable electricity generation is extremely high. And it's like, I did not see any study or suggestion that clearly says where this electricity and the hydrogen can come from sustainably. And there are quite a lot of risks, like in the supply chain, but also concerning the costs in the end. Yeah, so they can be an option in some, but very, very limited areas in the building sector.
Yeah, in the UK, the chief executive of the Climate Change Committee says that you need about 30 times more offshore wind to replace all the gas that's used for heating with hydrogen, and that made the headline into the Times. I think we have time for just a very quick question, and that is about taxes and levies. One of your measures, I think, on one of the last slides where you have all the policy measures, was about reforming taxes and levies. Could you just say a few more words about that? Because again, I know that's a very live issue in Germany.
What we see in most scenarios is that heat pumps are one of the key technologies for the future in the building sector, but currently electricity prices are extremely high, especially compared with natural gas or heating oil, and that's also due to the levies and taxes currently in place for electricity and currently missing for natural gas and fossil fuels. And like this should be adjusted in order to support the development of the technologies we need in the future.
Thank you. I think we only have a few seconds left. Now it's exactly 10:55 Central European time. So I think we should move on to the next presentation. Thank you, Benjamin, for your very insightful paper and your very insightful presentation and your great answers. We now have a presentation from Alexandra Prepper, who works at the Fraunhofer Institute, who have traditionally been at the summer study with at least 10 people every single time I've been there. I don't know how many people you've at the summer study this time, Alexandra. It's great to have you here, and we look forward to your presentation, which is again recorded, and it is about the policy measures in the German heating sector and looking at policy acceptance, which has already been hinted at by Benjamin in his presentation. So this is a very important topic. I look forward to your presentation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for your interest. Today, I would like to present to you our research paper with the title Policy Measures in the German Heating Sector, a review-based framework to study policy acceptance. I am Alexandra Pröpper. I'm currently a research candidate at the Fraunhofer Institute for System and Innovation Research, and this is the first paper of my PhD project. The main research questions we wanted to target in this paper are, well, how to incorporate the social dimension in the design of energy policies, especially with regard to policies that target the diffusion of heating technologies in Germany. And what are the factors that influence policy acceptance? And finally, how might a framework to study policy acceptance actually look like? Therefore, we conducted an extensive literature review, and based on the findings, we propose a framework for future research. I first start with a short overview of the challenges of the heating sector. According to the German Climate Action Plan 2050, GHG emissions are to be reduced in Germany by 80 to 95% by 2050. Through the expansion of renewable energy, progressive decarbonization of the electricity sector is already taking place in Germany, as you can see on the picture on the right. However, to date, fossil fuels have been predominantly used in the heating sector, while the share of renewable energy sources accounted to only 15% in 2020. So the decarbonization of the heat supply in buildings is still a challenge. The climate protection law specifies legally binding sectoral reduction targets by 2030, which is based on the Climate Protection Program 2030. But the projection report of the German government that includes GHG emissions saving projections for Germany, taking into account policy measures that were adopted by August 2018, states that emission targets in the building sector will likely be missed. And what is also important to mention is the recent decision of the Supreme Constitutional Court that the government's climate protection measures are insufficient to protect future generations, which also should have an impact on the Germany's new targets. Well, that all leads to Germany needs to think about new policy measures for the building sector, and preferably in the best possible way, not to overburdening the citizens and companies, as probably future policy regulations should go further than the actual that we have in place right now. And what concerns the building sector is that citizens are often the target group of policy measures in the building sector. Well, because domestic heating is a private domain, and also due to private house ownership. And so the response to policy instruments is critical to their successful implementations. It should be taken into account that the most efficient or effective considered policy measures that, for example, are predicted by techno-economical models are not always the ones that are equitable just from the citizen's point of view. So, but what drives actually citizens to accept or even support new policy measures? And what are important factors that should be considered in policy design? So the next slide, I want to talk about what it actually is social acceptance. Wüstenhagen et al. Have formalized the research field of social acceptance and have proposed the most acknowledged definition of social acceptance of renewable energy innovations. According to this definition, social acceptance can be divided into three dimensions: the social political, the market, and the community acceptance. While social political acceptance concerned all societal actors and targets, rather general political decisions and policy formulations. The level of market acceptance refers to acceptance by consumers, investors, and companies as adopters. And finally, community acceptance operates on very local level. So far, a lot of emphasis in research was set on market acceptance, actually, and the social acceptance of heating technologies. Also, studies focus on technological attributes of heating technologies, for example, and consumer choices to understand adoption potential, which of course is very relevant. However, in our paper, we want to have a more detailed look on social political acceptance level, meaning the policy measures that would foster the deployment of the technologies and their attributes. So for our research, we have conducted an extensive literature review on factors that influence policy acceptance, and we looked into the results of empirical research studies. From those studies, we selected those factors that seem to be directly related to policy design or policy attributes. We found that factors that are related to policy design can actually be grouped on a scale. There are factors that refer to objective attributes of a policy measure on one side, and on the other side, factors that affect the subjective perception of a policy measure by an individual. So the table below shows on the left side factors that also might constitute the policy attributes, but have an influence on the acceptance of a policy. But the right side shows what determines the perception and evaluation of the individual, considering this specific policy measure. So while it is quite difficult to make assumptions without empirical research whether a specific policy would be rather accepted or opposed by the public, it might be possible to derive from specific policy measure attributes the relevant factors that influence the individual's acceptance of a policy. Or based on the policy description of certain policies, we evaluate for some of the existing measures in the heating sector which factors from a citizen's point of view might be relevant for their assessment of policy acceptance. So I will make two examples. One is CO2 pricing for heating and transport. Well, CO2 pricing is a coercive measure, and the general assumption would be that citizens most likely would oppose any new taxes, especially when the price would be higher. But perceived personal burden would therefore play a major role, of course. But however, this factor might be balanced out if the policy measure addresses fairness and takes into account a fair distribution of costs among tenants and offers, for example, financial support for low-income households. Perceived effectiveness might also be important, as the financial burden needs to be justified to the public. On the other side, there are probably tax subsidies, which are a non-coercive measure. And it's likely that this measure would be accepted by the public without a lot of opposition. But however, effectiveness and fairness aspects might be also relevant for the acceptance by the citizens with regard to financing of the policy measure and explaining where this financing comes from. Coming to this point, I would now like to talk about the framework we would like to propose for the general study of policy acceptance. We have talked before about the relationship of the objective and subjective factors that are relevant for policy acceptance, which are shown in the graph on the left. Well, however, the individual's judgment on policy effectiveness, for example, might strongly be influenced by socio-psychological or demographic factors. So preferences for certain policies or beliefs about climate change might lead to a higher perceived effectiveness, which in turn would to some effect influence the individual to accept a rather coercive measure, for example. So there is another part of the equation. So in this graphic overall, we suggest the relationship between factors that influence the subjective perception and the specific attributes of the policy measure, which finally lead to policy acceptance of an individual. Objective policy attributes influence the perception and evaluation of a policy measure by an individual, but however, we assume that individual perception would differ among individuals, and they might prioritize policy attributes in various ways. And this prioritization would then mostly be dependent on social demographic and social psychological factors. But of course, it should be noted that all those assumptions need to be empirically tested. So just then to summarize the presentation, from our literature review, we have derived factors that are decisive when it comes to policy acceptance and should be considered for policy evaluation and policy design. We propose a framework on how factors that are important for policy acceptance might interact. And we also argue that policy design would require to especially account for factors of social policy perception, and we exemplarily look into existing policies. So important question that arise is on how to account for social acceptance actually in policy design. Well, for regulatory measures, we thought about that social fairness should be considered more strongly. For example, compensation or other advantages for a highly affected group. On the other hand, stronger subsidy programs could substantiate the financing of the measure and guarantee the accessibility for everyone, and yeah, to be accessible for the general citizens. And that's all for my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexandra, for your interesting contribution on the very important topic of the public or social acceptance of different policies, which I think is going to stay with us for quite some time as we're going to move towards much tougher climate goals and decarbonization goals. The first question I have for you is around really how policymakers could use your framework or your research to make policies more palatable, more acceptable to the public, and how they can actually engage the public in that process to make it easier for them to implement policies and not get a backlash. So any thoughts you have on how policymakers should help garner public acceptance would be very helpful.
Well, yes, the idea of this framework is still in development. So the next step we want to do is empirically test. We already have, for example, a poll with regard to effective policy measure, which we evaluate currently, and this will be the next paper we will publish to see if this framework actually makes sense. And of course, we will develop it further. But the idea is that, yes, we might have something at hand to generalize the approach for the evaluation of policy measures in the future. Yeah, exactly.
And is there a way, let's say if the government wants to implement a certain policy, how they can, from the beginning, try to build in acceptance in the implementation process? Is there a way of how to bring the public along with you think, by using certain approaches of communicating what is being planned? Or do you think it's more static and different types of policies are either more acceptable or less, but it can't really be changed by the government?
We think there should be ways to change that with that you just well, that's why we did the research on the factors, which actually is important for the citizens. And policy making should be also considering that there are factors exist and also taking into account. So if you propose a measure, just also think about all the other ways and measures, exactly about how communicating, about transparency to the citizens, that all should be taken into account. And where to communicate, which are the important actors who you should probably communicate, and how will they perceive. It's of course a big challenge for every policymaker to do this, but we're thinking about what would be the best way to do this, as we have seen there is not much research around currently.
Thank you. As you know, eceee has also paid a lot of attention to energy sufficiency, and this came up in one of the previous questions on Benjamin's presentation. When you think about public acceptance of sufficiency policies opposed to energy efficiency policies, what sort of does your research suggest? Are they fundamentally different, or actually are there similar issues for both efficiency and sufficiency?
I suppose it's very similar actually, and for sufficiency it might be even more complicated. Actually, to propose on one side to propose some measures, on the other side for the citizens to be in accordance with them. So probably maybe efficiency measures are most more likely to be accepted actually. What I think.
Thank you. Well, if there are any other questions from the audience, please do submit them via the app. I can't see any more questions when I look at the app on my screen. If there's anyone else, maybe Veit, if you have a question as my co-panel leader, you want to ask, I think we have a couple more minutes until the next presentation. If not, I suggest we move on to the final presentation of this session.
Maybe not a question, but more a comment to your last question, Jan. So the question of public acceptance towards efficiency opposed to sufficiency measures. I have the feeling that, in particular, sufficiency is always a very huge challenge with regard to public acceptance, because that's somehow interfering to the way we live, and in particular German individuals, and that might be, I think that's quite comparable to other European countries, but maybe not to all parts of the world. They do not really want policy to somehow to impact directly their lifestyle, and I think for that reason the question Alexandra, or the question Alexandra is trying to analyze within her research might be much more difficult when it comes to sufficiency.
Yeah, depends probably on the sufficiency policy, but I agree in principle with that. Alexandra, any final words? You've got a minute left. Anything you want to say to conclude?
No, thank you very much for your attention. Yes, continuing my research and keep you in the loop.
Yeah, we look forward to the paper, the next paper at the next summer study that might take place relatively soon. So hopefully we see you present that at the next summer study. Thank you.
Hopefully.
Okay, well, let's move on then to our final presentation of the day by Jonas Schwemke, who is also working at the Fraunhofer Institute. Jonas is talking about discourse network analysis of domestic heating in Germany. Very different take on the subject. I'm really excited to hear his presentation. Over to you, Jonas. Looking forward to hearing your recording.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Jonas Schwemke. I'm here near Lake Constance, the blazing sun. and I'll be talking about discourse network analysis of domestic heating in Germany. These are some results from my master thesis, which I wrote for Fraunhofer eceee. And I worked on this together with Alex, who presented before me, and Heike, who is panel leader of panel 2, I believe. So let's start. This is the content of the presentation. First the background, then the research questions, data, method, and results. But they're not always in that order, because sometimes it's more helpful to have the method right before the result to not lose track in the meantime. Some background. In 2019, the German government created the Climate Action Program 2030, which aims at reducing the CO2 emissions by 55% compared to 1990. Studies show, however, that the current measures are just not sufficient to reach those goals. So we want to look at policy acceptance in the media and thus contribute some empirical data from the social sciences to more technical agent-based models. We're also going to look at the term framing, which was introduced to the social sciences, and it describes the way that events are characterized and which parts are highlighted and which are neglected. We want to find out which actors have a very high standing in the discourse and want to see if we can identify any coalitions. Also, we want to look at the concepts and how they're framed and see if there were any changes in the time frame that we chose, which was 2015 to 2019. And in 2019 there were the climate protests, so we wanted to see if they had any impact on this particular discourse. We got the data from LexisNexis and we chose a bunch of keywords to filter all the relevant articles for our time frame from 2015 to 2019. And then we selected 6 sources, 3 national, 3 regional, and those regional ones we got with a little bit of geographical spread. So one from the east, a very small local paper, and then one from the Rhine-Main area, which is highly populated and kind of urban, and then one from the southwest, from Stuttgart. And with these filters we got about 1,300 articles, but only about a third of them had relevant passages in them. To filter the articles from LexisNexis, we chose general keywords like heating, renewment, and also some keywords that related to a certain policy, for instance, the ban of oil heating. This is an overview of the approach. First, we wanted to extract and code the statements, then create policy networks, and then analyze and visualize them. This is one coding example. We have a statement, but this statement is not from an outsider, it's from the author of the article themselves, and that's why we attribute it to the newspaper, to the source. If, say, a politician made a statement, we would attribute it to the party of the politician, same for representatives of associations or companies. In this case, there was support for the concept, so this is important for constructing the networks in the later step. And this statement also had a frame, in this case cost, but statements also could have no frame. Discourse network analysis is a fairly young technique which helps you to extract statements from unstructured text and then create policy networks. With these networks you can quickly identify coalitions or popular actors. There are different network types. One of them is the affiliation network. You can see it in the top right corner. In this type of network you have both actors and concepts, and it can be helpful to quickly get a great overview of your discourse. A congruence network, you have actors that are connected if both of them agree or disagree on the same concept. A conflict network, 2 actors are connected if one of them agrees and the other disagrees on the same topic. The subtract networks is the net relationship of both congruence and conflict. Now we get into the results. First, an overview of the network. Then we go over the standing of actor categories and parties, the community detection, the concepts, and the framing over time. Alright, let's start with the affiliation network. On the left-hand side, you see the actors, on the right-hand side, the policies. Actors and policies are connected if an actor made a statement about one of the policies. The color of the edge displays the agreement. Green means high agreement, red means low agreement or no agreement. And the thickness of the edge displays how many statements were made by an actor about this particular policy. And this is helpful to gain a good overview, and you can see that CDU made a lot of statements about the wreckage premium of oil heating, and these were largely positive. That's why the edge is green. And the Green Party has also a thick edge towards the subsidies for fossil fuel technologies. Which types of actors are present in the discourse? On top of the list are associations. They had 128 statements, which was about 22.8% of all statements. This means that economic interests really drive the discourse about domestic heating. Parties and administration are only in second and third place, and then come consumer centers, which also contributed quite a few statements, mostly towards technologies and tips for end users, how to use them and which to consider. When I took a closer look at the statements made by associations, these were not about the technologies only, which they probably wanted to promote. No, a lot of the statements were about policies, so this is one more indicator that the associations have a large impact on the discourse. What was also surprising was that environmental organizations only contributed very, very few statements in this time frame. So this means that this particular subset of climate change discourse was not highly impacted directly by environmental actors. Standing describes the impact that an actor has in a particular discourse, and you can measure it simply by the count or share of statements that this actor gave. And here we looked at the statements of parties and how much they compare to their seat share in the Bundestag. Because if you look at indexing theory, you would guess that the media gets as many statements from a party as they have power in the politics. And here you can see the net relationship between the seat share and the standing in this particular discourse. And the most interesting finding here is that the Grüne had a much higher net of standing compared to the seats in both legislative periods. On the previous slide, I talked about discourse networks and how they can be created from unstructured text. And when you have an actor congruence network in which actors are connected that agree or disagree on the same topic, then you can apply community detection to quickly identify coalitions. And for that, one approach uses modularity. Modularity is a measurement for how much a network can be divided into groups. One algorithm tries to maximize the modularity of a given partition and then shows you how the network can be divided. For instance, on these two pictures, you see on the left side a network with a very low modularity. On the right side, you can find a partition that pushes the modularity to a higher value because you have many groups that are very highly interconnected but are not so strongly connected to other parts of the network. We created actor congruence networks, and now we want to identify belief coalitions. And if you look at these two networks, one only for policies and one for technologies, you see that both of them look more like the network on the left on the former slide. So this means that these networks don't have very high modularity, and the communities that the algorithm detected are not very strong, which you can see when you look at the density of these individual partitions. As they are very low and only have a very small share of connections made that would have been possible between these actors, you can see that the community structure of the actor congruence networks is very weak. which is first of all a good news, because that means that the discourse is not highly polarized. But when we did the same for the actor conflict networks, we found a very similar picture. And this led us to look at the subtract network, which displays the net relationship of both conflict and congruence. Now this is the subtract network for actors, and here you can quickly identify two opposing groups. This layout is a spring layout, and of course there are other possible layouts, but here the algorithm tried to separate actors as much as possible if they had a conflict net relationship, for instance here between the CDU and the Grünen, and wanted to lay out two nodes very close to each other if they had a strong positive relationship. So for instance, a lot of statements both agreeing with the same concept. And on this subtract network, we identified two groups, one on the left side, which consists of more business-oriented actors, for instance, the FDP and CDU, which are closer to business and more conservative in this regard, and also fossil fuel actors. The VEH and the IWO are both oil trading associations. And in the right-hand side, you see the Social Democrats, the Green Party, and also the Green-led Ministry for Environment of the state of Baden-Württemberg. Still, most actors were in the middle, but you can identify that there are two opposing belief coalitions. We also looked at the concepts, which concepts were discussed the most and with which sentiment. And you can see on the left side that among the policies, the ban on oil heating and the RECH premium were discussed a lot, but almost all actors agreed that there is a necessity for CO2 pricing. And there were only negative statements about the transparency of the application for subsidies for renewable heating, which is very interesting to find out, because acceptance will probably stay low if the transparency is bad. Among the technologies, the most popular was not renewable, was the condensing oil boiler technique. And among the renewable technologies, biomass led the list and was only then followed by heat pumps, which also had a lot of negative statements. We expected that renewable energy technologies were mostly framed positive in regard of the environment and negative in regard of the cost, and the other way around for fossil fuel technologies. And this is true in relative numbers, but in absolute numbers, there are even more positive statements regarding the environment about fossil fuel technologies, and even more positive statements regarding the cost about renewable technologies. And this is due because more statements were positive to both categories of technologies. When we looked at the framing of concepts over time, we found that indeed in 2019 the environment was the most popular frame. So this lets us conclude that the Fridays for Future movement had an impact on this discourse, even though we earlier saw that environmental organizations did not make statements in this discourse. To summarize, we can say that associations have the highest standing in the discourse and environmental organizations almost none, even though in 2019 the environmental frame gained a lot of popularity, possibly due to the climate protests around Fridays for Future. We can also see that there are two opposing belief systems at play, but this also depends on the method used. The actors mostly agree on the necessity of CO2 pricing, but they disagree on the exact implementation. Thank you for listening. It's getting pretty hot here in the sun by the Bodensee, and I'll see you right now in the discussions. I'm gonna get myself some water. Hello everybody,
Thanks, Jonas. Although that was interesting, I don't think we need to watch it again. My first question to you really is about the carbon pricing that you mentioned. And if I understood you correctly, you said that there has been a consensus pretty much from across the spectrum that carbon pricing is a necessary measure. Which is, I think, is an interesting result, because you would expect there would have been quite a bit of resistance from those supplying fossil fuels that are being used for heating. So could you say a bit more about the discourse around carbon pricing, why you think that consensus formed, what the factors were that contributed to it, and whether you think that will be sustained, because at some point you could imagine that some of the very carbon-intensive fossil fuels like heating oil will be simply priced out of the market, and the companies supplying them will go out of business. So I'm interested in your thoughts as to whether we can expect a harmonious coalition of actors pushing for carbon pricing, or whether at some point that will fall apart as the impact of that measure will beginning to bite.
First of all, I have to say that the whole terminology was sometimes quite confusing, because what was called CO2 pricing and how it was defined differed across actors, I would say, and also over time, because what they called CO2 price, and there was a debate mostly between having the trade of the emission system, having it included in the EU system, and also on the other hand having just a fixed price and a tax. And some people called it tax, even though it was not actually a tax, it was just the trade system. So first of all, I found it quite confusing. I think this is also difficult for the readers of newspapers. They can't be sure what the media is really talking about. And I found it surprising that there was consensus, but the overall sentiment towards CO2 is, of course, still very, very polarized. And it also depends highly on the sources that you select. So because we wanted to have sources that have a lot of articles, so we have quantitative methods, we chose just not sources that are more from from further ends of the political spectrum, which had probably fewer articles. We also didn't have any tabloids. So I'd say these findings also very highly depend on the sources that we selected.
Thank you. And you mentioned, I think, Fridays for Future at some point in your presentation. I mean, did they directly comment on this issue of heating or carbon pricing, or do you think it's more the broader discourse around the need to reduce emissions that have played a role here?
Yeah, I was surprised to not really find any statements by them directly in my data, in my text data. Then, because I wanted to write more about that, I looked into their programs online, and I didn't find these more granular topics. I found more bigger topics like end coal and so on. But I think they would improve their program if they would have more hands-on practical ideas for how to improve CO2 emission. If they would have something more practical statements about the ban on oil heatings, for instance, and how to implement it, that would be definitely helpful.
Thank you. So if I'm a policymaker and I look at your research, what do you think I could learn from it in constructing, developing, implementing the policies going forward? I mean, how can I take advantage of your research and your insights?
I think for me, the most interesting finding, even though I didn't highlight it that much in this presentation, is that there was complete consensus on how bad the transparency really is when you want to apply for subsidies. If you want to have renewable heating in your home, you want to apply, it's just not a very transparent process. Even the Minister on Economic Affairs Peter Altmaier has criticized this and said he couldn't do it when he tried to do it for his personal home. So I think this is the most important finding. And apart from that, there were not that many surprising findings, but I think this method has potential if maybe there are better methods to automatically identify statements, because then you could have could more easily include more sources and monitor what's going on in the media, maybe even in almost real time, and see where the trends are going, what the public is perceiving in the media.
Thank you. I've got one final question. So if you had a crystal ball and you could look to 2030, how has the discourse around this topic evolved in Germany? You know, what has changed? What would you expect where we are in the discussion 10 years down the line? And will we meet the 2030 climate goals?
Very hard for me to say, because I'm not really an expert on these topics, but yeah, I would assume that even in 2030, people will still not like any bans on anything, because that's, I think, just part of human nature. So if, for instance, oil heating, if that might be gone by 2030, I assume, but there will always be some technologies that are not super clean, and people just don't want to hear bans. So that's what I think will stay the same way. And the goals, I would say, doesn't look like they will be met right now, but it's better to be optimistic. Maybe they will, not sure.
Actually, thank you. In the meantime, a question has come in through the app, and we have time for that. So I want to read that out to you. So the question is, how can it be positive to use fossil fuels? How can the supporters explain their position? And isn't the role of the ministry to put some clarity on this or not? That's the question.
Again, very difficult for me to answer. Because I think a lot of people are not really interested in climate change still, and they don't think it's that bad. They don't realize how bad it is, because it's not an immediate threat. But what is an immediate threat is if someone comes and tells you oil heating is banned and what you're doing is banned, and you have to find a way to do it even though you live on the countryside and you're not connected to natural gas. And that's what is an immediate threat for people, and that's what they will deal with first. And what they do is they vote for parties that don't ban oil heating.
Thank you. I think that's a great segue to the panel discussion. So I'd like to move us to the final part of this session this morning, which is the panel discussion, which involves all the panelists and also me and Veit, my co-panel leader. If you could switch on your cameras, that would be great, fellow panelists. Thank you. That's great. We still can't see. Hi, Alexander. Thank you. So the question about regulation that Jonas just pointed to, you know, the banning specific technologies, also came up in a presentation yesterday about minimum energy performance standards, which potentially could also be applied to heating. I'm interested in the sort of panel's views as to what role regulation should and could play, and how to maybe address some of those barriers that Jonas pointed to, you know, the lack of public acceptance of those. But at the same time, you know, we are in a climate crisis or climate emergency, and we need to reduce emissions. So can we really do this simply by providing incentives and a bit of carbon pricing, or do we actually need those bans, those regulations? And if so, how could it be done? So I'm interested in your views, whether optimistic or pessimistic. Anyone who wants to go first? There's no right or wrong answers to this, I think.
Well, then I just start. As I said before, I think prices and incentives won't be sufficient to achieve the long-term targets, long-term goals. I think that bans are an efficient option. But concerning the acceptance, I think they have to be accompanied by good information, good communication. And also, if some technologies in the heating sector or building sector are banned, the alternatives must be supported in a good way. So it must be like comprehensive setting between banning on the one side, but also supporting the alternatives sufficiently.
So what you're saying is it's hard to force people to adopt a technology that is clean, low carbon, but a lot more expensive than the fossil fuel alternative that they're currently having.
Probably hard, and as Jonas said, like still many people are in the old fossil world and like still focus on that. So I think that we somehow have to push people in the direction of renewables, and that simply informing and supporting won't be enough.
Any other views on the panel? Alexandra or Jonas?
Yes, yes, I totally agree with it. There are, of course, questions of, yeah, I mean, democracy is still in the air. How can we do this in an efficient way, but also to get everyone in the boat to agree with those more coercive policy measures, of course. Yes, but I would totally agree that bans would be necessary in the future, and the current policies as we see now are not enough. So, yeah, but still we have to think to make it more acceptable by everyone.
Yeah, I also agree that bans are necessary, and I think you can't implement these things without stepping on some feet. So, and I think it's okay if some people don't like what they're getting when they're when oil heating is banned, for instance. But in the long run, I think it would be definitely worth it.
Thank you. I actually wrote a paper many years ago about banning was called Banning the Bulb, I think. It was about light bulbs and the politics around the light bulb ban in Germany. I don't know whether people are still discussing light bulbs these days. Probably not so much. And we all just accepted that, yeah, it's changed. We can buy LEDs. They've become so cheap and actually a better technology. So I wonder to some extent, maybe it's just part of the natural policy cycle that there is resistance from different actors. There's a discourse around it that changes over time. And at some point, people understand that things will have to change, but there will always be resistance along the way. And it's never going to be a consensual path. Veit, anything you would like to chip in with?
Only maybe also some comments, not really a question, but related to the statement that many people still stick to the old world. I think this also to the fossil world. I think that also applies to the view on technologies, in particular with regard to heat pumps, for instance. How often do you hear heat pumps are only applicable and efficient in new buildings, which is it's an old thinking. So the technology has been improved. Nowadays, you can run and operate a heat pump in a building which hasn't been refurbished, but still that heat pump runs rather efficient. So I think we always have to the narrative of technologies and of policies need to change over time, and also here we are lagging behind, and I think that's also a huge communicative challenge to change that?
Well, I guess we're all asked to be active in the discussion, and I mean, partly we do this by writing papers, but is there another role that we should play as researchers and analysts to help that debate to be channeled in a more helpful direction? That you can see how can we as a community, or eceee community, feed into this process in a helpful way that isn't just saying you need to do X, but ignoring the politics around it. Is there something else that we could be doing?
Well, we have to communicate our knowledge and like based on facts and really like bring them into the discussion. I was actually kind of surprised by the analysis of Jonas. That's like many think tanks, I would say they are very active in the public discussion, did not appear, at least in the graphs, which at least for me showed that what we know and what we find out in all our research projects is not necessarily seen in the wider public. And I think that's a big problem. And that also shows us that we should be more active in this way. So probably not only communicating our results in the research bubble, but also to a broader public.
There's a great blog post opportunity on the eceee website, of course. No, that reaches only a certain number of people, but I know many have used this before, and I can recommend it if you wanted to share your research in a more targeted form, a bit more accessible form than a peer-reviewed paper or presentation. I just wonder what else we should discuss. I see the attendees are slowly leaving, maybe going to other panels or making themselves some coffee. We still have a bit of time, but we can also finish a little earlier. Is there something that you would like to discuss, any of you, any of the panelists, or Veit, anything we haven't discussed yet, anything you would like to bring up as a topic before we leave? I don't see anyone stepping forward. So I think we have an announcement to make before we leave, which is about the informal sessions that take place later today. We've been asked to make some noise about those. They will take place at 4:15 Central European Summer Time in Zoom meeting mode, so you can actually participate in a live discussion rather than just asking questions through the app. One of those sessions is led by Paolo Bertoldi from the European Commission's Joint Research Center, and he's going to discuss the impact of energy efficiency projects on property values, rents, and credit risks. And the other session is led by Cédric Gironet from SIG, and he will discuss a concept for a pan-European interactive knowledge transfer platform for radical energy savings. That sounds very promising. So again, both of those will take place at 4:15 Central European Summertime via Zoom, and you can all join the discussion if you want to. So I thank you all for your questions, all the attendees who showed up this morning. Thanks to the panelists. Thanks also to Veit for supporting me and chairing and moderating this session. And I look forward to the next session of this panel. Veit, when is the next session of panel 7 again? I'm just looking at my diary here, but if you have it in front of you, I think
it's tomorrow morning, 10:30, and it will be about finance and investment for energy efficiency in buildings. That's the main topic.
Excellent. Well, I hope I see many of you there. Benjamin, Alexandra, Jonas, make yourself a coffee now and relax. Well done, and thanks for your contributions.
Thank you.